2 weeks ago, I announced a deck building challenge, and that challenge went as follows. Choose a commander from among Eomer, Marshal of Rohan, Yomiji who bars the way, Egon God of Death, Shizuko, Caller of Autumn, and Senator Peacock, and build a deck with it, prioritizing creativity, cohesion, and likelihood to produce dynamic gameplay. Over the course of the ensuing week, an explosion of deck building occurred, far more than I expected honestly, and at the end of this period I was left with around 250 decks to dig through. I went through every single one of these decks, reading primers and scoping out card choices and feeling out the vibes until I was left with a handful of finalists for each of the commanders. I then discussed these finalists with a couple friends who helped me pick out a winner for each of the 5. So I will now be announcing those winners, talking about each of those decks, and also giving some honorable mentions, which will be shown off in their own tab on my website. I'll also give some ideas for improvement where I see fit. These are all great decks, and many are creative in ways I probably wouldn't think to be, but the task of improving an already great deck is a fun one, and I love having fun. Let's start with Senator Peacock, a 5-mana commander who makes all your artifacts clues, artifacts which can be sacrificed to draw a card, and who makes a creature unblockable whenever you sacrifice a clue. Most decks submitted for this fell into one of two categories, artifact good stuff decks, and political decks that played off the commander's senator status. For a few honorable mentions, we had an artifact-based combo deck, a ninjas deck, and a stacks deck, all of which can be found in a link in the description. However, for this commander there was a clear winner among both me and the people I discussed things with. Filthy Stacks Player's Modular Beatdown deck. See, one of the difficulties with Senator Peacock, and a reason she likely had so few decks as of the start of this challenge, was that for each of her 2 abilities, there are commanders that do something similar at a better rate. This makes her hard to justify as a commander choice if you're primarily only using one of her 2 modes, so a clear goal for building a Senator Peacock deck is figuring out how to use both halves of the card, the sacrifice to draw as well as the evasion. Modular is a brilliant solution to this challenging question. Artifact creatures that transfer their +1/+1 counters to other creatures when they die have both a clear reason to want to hit the yard, and a clear reason to want to be unblockable. Now, all of this comes at a cost, and that's that there aren't very many modular creatures, and a lot of the ones that do exist are terrible. This deck runs all the ones within its color identity that cost 4 or less mana, which ends up being a total of 9. Some of these are still pretty bad, such as Arcbound Hybrid, a 2/2 haste creature for 4 mana, but the keyword is what really matters, and the rest of the deck is built out to bolster that keyword. The deck is running a number of other cards that can grant and gain counters, as well as 9 proliferate cards, and 8 other cards that can utilize counters in some way. These include things like Danny Pink that provide payoffs for counters moving around, as well as cards like Giggling Skitterspike and Inkmoth Nexus that provide excellent destinations for counters to be placed on. I like that this deck doesn't overuse Infect. It's common for players to throw some extra Infect into a Proliferate deck as an alternate win con, which works, but can really put opponents on edge and attract unwanted attention. Here, the Infect cards are kept exclusively to Inkmoth Nexus as a potential one-shot with Modular, and Plaguemere as a card that doubles as a dork. And this definitely is a healthy place to stop. Overall, this deck's beatdown game plan seems quite decent, and even features Tangletrove Kelp as a top-end card that goes unbelievably hard with Peacock. To bolster its artifact beats, this deck also features a lovely suite of support cards. It's packing plenty of interaction with 7 cards aimed at countering spells or protecting things, and 9 cards aimed primarily at removal or defense. And there are a handful of cards in other categories that can also serve removing purposes, such as Contagion Engine. There's also a quite nice layered draw and ramp suite. 10 cards each that I'd categorize as primarily in one of those categories, but also a lovely range of cards that serve double duty with other purposes. Tezzeret's Gambit draws and proliferates, Staff of Completion ramps and proliferates, Cryptic Trilobite ramps and holds counters, Teferi Betrayer of Flesh draws and ramps, and Season of Weaving does all sorts of stuff. This overlapping of roles, along with the deck's relatively low mana curve, likely lets it play quite smoothly. So overall, I'm a big fan of this deck. It uses the commander excellently and features a well-chosen and well-rounded suite of cards within it. It looks capable of putting on pressure in multiple different ways, dishing out good damage but also being resilient and able to play into a longer and grindier game. To get to some points of improvement, I personally would try to build out more of a recursion suite. Scrap Trawler, Mirror Retriever, even something like Inventive Iteration, all of these provide nice ways to bring back some of the lower cost sacrifice modular creatures and utilize them further, which could allow the deck to maintain pressure better. Moving along, the next commander is Shizuko, Caller of Autumn, a 3-mana 2/3 that produces 3 green mana for each player on their untap step that sticks around for the whole turn. This one is definitely the most open-ended out of the bunch, and is also a pretty group-huggy card in general. Most of the Shizuko submissions involved some blend of Battlecruiser, Group Hug, and Stacks, roughly in that order of popularity. However, there were also some very different submissions as well. Honorable mentions for this category included a Storm deck, a face-down creatures deck with the goal of not tapping lands on its own turn, and a Protean Hulk combo deck sped up by Shizuko's mana boost. You can check out all of those in the link in the description. The winner of Shizuko was once again relatively clear to my team. Spelltech's Lands deck. This is a deck with the goal of repeatedly looping Talent Gates of Bandara in order to keep Shizuko phased out on opposing untap steps, preventing them from gaining her mana. This is a great concept. I wouldn't have ever thought to try and fully break parity on Shizuko's ability. I definitely asked myself the question of whether it's worth the effort, and from a strategic optimization-y sort of standpoint, that's a valid question, but I think there's enough there to work with. A one-sided 3-mana boost on a 3-mana commander is nothing to sneeze at, and worth putting a bit of effort into maintaining, and keeping Shizuko phased out also has some side benefits, like strengthening the deck's board wipe resistance. It's also, if nothing else, very funny to play a group hug commander only to put a lot of effort into denying opponents the hug. As you might expect, this deck runs all the cards needed to enable the Shizuko phase-out plan. Tutors to find the talent gates, cards to sacrifice lands to perform effects, and cards that allow the deck to access lands from its graveyard. All of these are already great things for a land stack to have, so the fact that they're all that's required to enable this deck's devious hug denial is a big point in its favor. As with most lands decks, this is a deck that will be looking to acquire different lands for different situations. Cavern of Souls helps get around counterspells. Boseiju Who Endures can deal with artifacts and enchantments. Glacial Chasm stonewalls aggression. Scavenger Grounds deals with graveyards, and so on. These lands make up this deck's toolbox, its base of cards that it can draw on through tutors to help remedy various problems that it might encounter. In addition, a good portion of these lands have effects that involve sacrificing or discarding them, and then this allows these effects to be utilized multiple times. 6 or Life from the Loam can repeat cycle lands or Boseiju, and all manner of sacrifice lands can be repeated through Undergrowth Recon, Ramunup Excavator, or Aranis Gloomstalker. This allows the deck to be quite grindy, usually having something it can put its mana into. The deck also has lots of other neat utility cards woven throughout it. A number of different options for stacks, defense, and removal can be found throughout the deck, many of them concentrated among the lands. Though the deck doesn't have a ton of options for each different type of effect, its toolboxy nature and high density of recursion likely means it should be able to repeat various interactive effects as necessary. Finally, this deck has a few different options for winning. The first is a classic. Thespian Stage can become a copy of Dark Depths. Original Depths is sacrificed to the Legend rule. The former stage is sacrificed to create a 20/20 Merit Lodge because it has no counters on it. Rinse and repeat with land recursion if the Merit Lodge dies. The deck can also go wide with Field of the Dead or Titania, Protector of Argoth, and Helix Pinnacle serves as a last resort mana sink win con if the board is forfeit and the deck is buckling down behind a Glacial Chasm or a Constant Mists. The deck's looping nature also means that there are some incidental infinite combos if it gets enough mana and pieces, but these feel more than fair. They're more a byproduct of being ahead, rather than setting up for a combo in the traditional sense. So overall, this deck seems well-rounded and fun. If I were to offer a point of critique, I'd say that this deck could use some more options for extra land plays. Being able to loop a utility land 2 or 3 times a turn rather than 1 is a big deal, and could allow the deck to spend its Shizuko mana more effectively. My friend 3/3 Elk, who's a lands aficionado, also suggested Nidlea's Intervention as a good card, as well as a card like Yavimaya Cradle of Growth that could allow Glacial Chasm and Dark Depths to tap for mana. Just a handful of ideas for land players out there. The third commander from among the 5 was Eomer, Marshal of Rohan, a 4-mana 4/4 haste creature that grants an extra combat once per turn when another attacking legendary creature dies. This was actually the card that inspired the challenge. Here was a commander with a wonderfully textured ability on it, and yet it only had around 100 decks on EDA Trek. There were a lot of super cool versions of this commander submitted. A few honorable mentions were a goblin deck that paired Eomer's ability with a variety of different goblins, a toolbox combo deck that focused on staying flexible while keeping opponents on their toes, and a hyper-budget pingers deck with no sacrifice outlets. All 3 of these can be found at the link in the description. For the number 1 deck, though, we have Lockfin's Reanimator deck. Yes, that's Mono Red Reanimator. This deck focused around a specific critical card, Godpharaoh's Gift. This is a 7-mana artifact that reads, at the beginning of combat on your turn, you may exile a creature card from your graveyard. If you do, create a token that's a copy of that card, except it's a 4/4 black zombie. It gains haste until end of turn. Extra combats from Eomer mean extra zombies from Godpharaoh's Gift, allowing the deck to build advantage as successive combat phases pass. Naturally, there are a number of different components that the deck needs in order to accomplish its Godpharaoh gifting. The first of these is Tutors, of which the deck is running 4. One of these is Gate to the Afterlife, a card that searches up Godpharaoh's Gift by name, so that's pretty cool. The other 3 tutors are gamble-style effects, where cards are searched up, followed by a discard at random, and these are nice because even if the tutored card gets discarded, the deck has plenty of ways of reanimating artifacts. Speaking of, the deck runs 4 cards that return artifacts from its graveyard to play, including a new Duretti that's being printed in the upcoming racing-themed set. 3 out of the 4 of these cards require artifacts to sacrifice, so the deck also contains 5 cards that generate artifact tokens, and that's in addition to the fact that about a quarter of the deck is artifacts that themselves can be sacrificed. The final thing required for this deck's reanimator plan is ways to get cards into the graveyard, and it has a wide variety of these. There are several filtering cards like Faithless Looting and Brass's Tunnel Grinder that help the deck selectively toss stuff into the yard, as well as a handful of mill effects like Milliken or Altar of Dementia. This list of different things required for the artifact reanimation plan may sound like a major hurdle to the deck's functionality, but thankfully all of these different tools are helpful on their own, and most serve other purposes for the deck, which is good, because all of that was just to get Godpharaoh's Gift on board and fueled up in the first place. From here, we need to gain some extra combats in order to take advantage of the card. To do this, we really only need 3 things: Eomer on board, legendary creatures to die while attacking, and effects to ensure their death. There are some number of fairly conventional sack outlets, but also some fling effects, and some cards that can copy legendary creatures. One of these is Blade of Selves, a card that goes infinite-ish with Eomer by creating 2 copies of him when he attacks that immediately see each other die to legend rule, giving 2 additional combats, and this then continues until there are fewer than 4 players in the game. A number of submitted Eomer decks included this card, but the fact that this deck gets additional value on each combat phase gives it a much better chance of being able to win the game right then and there, rather than just deleting the opponent who forgot to pack blockers and then passing the turn. And this sort of thing would be very much an earned combo win in my book. If you do the setup of getting your core engine online, getting a stocked graveyard for it, getting Blade of Selves, and obtaining a clear attack path for Eomer, it's hard to call that gimmicky or unearned. Overall, this deck is doing a lot of good stuff and has some cool cohesion to it. As far as areas of improvement go, the removal suite is relatively sparse, consisting of mostly a handful of fling effects plus a portal to Phyrexia. While this could work for a more aggressive deck, Godpharaoh's Gift is very much a value over time sort of card, and some more tools to slow down opponents to help the deck gain that time would likely be welcome. The 4th commander is Egon, God of Death. This one is dual-sided. The front side is a 3-mana 6/6 Death Touch that is sacrificed on upkeep unless its controller exiles 2 cards from their graveyard. The backside is a 1-mana artifact that mills a card from its controller's library each turn and has a 3-mana tap ability that exiles a creature card from its controller's graveyard and draws a card. Around half of submissions were basically a generic-ish Throne of Death graveyard pile of some form or other, but among the other half of decks there was a ton of variety. Exiting graveyard synergies, things to take advantage of Aegon's sweet power to mana cost ratio, some funky control decks with Throne of Death, and so on. One of the trickiest things about picking a favorite deck for this commander was asking the question of what decks represented Egon. A deck can have Egon or Throne of Death in the command zone, but one of my main judging criteria was cohesion, and to me cohesion requires that a deck feels like the commander truly belongs. There were some really cool honorable mentions for this one, including 2 different secret commander decks, one with Hakon and Nazguls that was all about playing knights from the graveyard, and one with Convergence of Dominion that was all about using creatures with graveyard abilities. However, the deck that felt the most undeniably Aegon of the bunch was Starfizz Voltron deck. Now, I did get a handful of other Voltron submissions, but this deck was a cut above the rest in one key area: compactness. I discussed compactness in my last video as a necessary feature in a deck that is going to need to devote some unnegotiable amount of space to a particular task. In this case, one of the biggest challenges of building an Aegon Voltron deck is navigating his downside while still building a functional deck. For Voltron purposes, Egon has a pretty clear upside. He's a 6/6 Death Touch beater for 3 mana, a pretty unbeatable raid. However, the need to constantly restock the graveyard to keep exile fodder for him poses a real challenge. If we think about mill as its own category of card, and think about how many sources of mill are needed in order to constantly keep Aegon up, it's kind of a lot. Like 15 is my go-to number for a card I want during the vast majority of curve-outs, and I'll even hedge closer to 20 if it's a card type I truly can't live without. That's not an insignificant amount of deck space. Where Starfizz's deck stands out then is in its proficiency at integrating this essential task into the rest of its game plan, making the task of keeping a graveyard stocked for Aegon to eat a mostly painless one. There are around 7 or 8 cards I'd identify as being basically exclusively graveyard fodder, which isn't a horrendously high number, and then the rest of the deck's graveyard stocking is built into other categories. You've got fantastic draw engines like Ripples of Undeath and Mask of Memory, you've got Armix in the removal sphere, a bunch of other assorted cards with discard or mill attached, and that's not even getting to the lands. The deck is running a big old pile of fetch lands, as well as several other adjacent effects like Traveler's Amulet. The net result of this is that the deck has a decent handful of high-caliber mill engines, but also a ton of cards that incrementally contribute to the self-mill game plan without really requiring any commitment. What does the rest of this deck look like? Well, among the core Voltron pieces, you've got 6 protection pieces, 4 pieces of evasion, and 11 cards for pumping up Aegon's power. The protection was roughly what you'd expect, all the classics like Swiftfoot Boots, as well as Assault Suit, which is a fun inclusion as both extra damage and as anti-sacrifice tech. Among the evasion cards, 3 of the 4 grant Trample, which makes sense with a Death Touch commander. You don't really need conventional evasion if you have a Death Touch commander that's too big for opponents to kill. We also see 5 haste enablers, which makes sense with a commander with a very efficient power to cost ratio. The pump cards are interesting, both in terms of what's here and in the fact that the deck has so many. A lot of the Voltron builds I saw for Egon largely neglected the bigger pump equipments, basically accepting that they were going to be finishing off opponents in 3 to 4 hits. This is a valid choice, but it does remove a lot of the explosive bite of 1 to 2 hit kill Voltron. The player removal is less of an option when those players have longer to do their problematic game plans. Among the rest of this deck, we have a decently hefty removal suite, a modest ramp package, an average-sized draw package, and a small handful of leaving graveyard synergies. Overall, this deck seems quite well-rounded, and plays to the strengths of Egon. If I had to offer points of improvement, my only note would be that fitting in a bit more evasion might be wise, since 4 is a number that you might struggle to find some games. The final commander option was Yomiji, who bars the way. This is a 7-mana 4/4 that reads, whenever another legendary permanent is put into a graveyard, return that card to its owner's hand. I wanted to have different commanders that would appeal to different sorts of players in this challenge, and this one is definitely aimed at the most audacious Johnnies of the world. The first thing that jumps out when looking at the card is that glorious original Kamigawa jank factor. This card is a 7-mana 4/4 with no keywords and a single line of text that is basically a symmetrical status effect. This card is, on the surface, bad, but it's also undeniably unique. There is no other commander that comes anywhere close to doing what this card does. I made a discussion forum with a thread for discussing each of the 5 commanders, and the Yomiji thread saw more activity than the other 4 combined. These folks were cooking. There were all sorts of decks submitted. Control decks, spirit decks, blink decks, Super Friends decks, combo decks of all stripes, and more. This commander also saw a difficult decision among the top 2 decks. Heighten's $50 control deck was an undeniably cool budget riff on the commander, complete with all sorts of creative packages for grinding value. However, it was the sheer cohesion, tuning, and clarity of vision in Aleph Zero's high-power combo deck that ended up coming out on top. The basic shape of most of the deck's combos goes something like this. You've got your legendary permanent to be looped, your sacrifice outlet, and then some sort of payoff. Take Mox Amber. You cast it, you tap it for mana, you sacrifice it to give Thermal Navigator flying, Yomiji bars the way and sends it back to your hand, and then you rinse and repeat as necessary. Then, with the arbitrary amount of white mana that results, you can loop a different artifact such as Throne of Eldraine, repeatedly casting and activating the Draw 2 Cards ability until you find something like Grinding Station or Blind Obedience, which can turn further looping into an endless stream of mill or life loss, respectively, for your opponents. There are a number of different ways to assemble a combo here. One piece of this is that there are 6 sack outlets, which each combo with different selections of loopable legendaries and payoffs. The Iron Crag is an infinite colorless mana generator if Krark Clan Ironworks and the Commander are out, but a simple mana rock with any other sack outlet. Hope of Girapur is an infinite mana generator with Ashnod's Altar and Krark Clan Ironworks on board, infinitely castable but needing an outlet with a Phyrexian Altar on board, and a simple 1/1 flyer with any of the other 3 sack outlets. The fact that it's both a creature and an artifact makes Hope of Girapur one of the most important legendaries in the deck for looping purposes, alongside Mox Opal and Mox Amber, which generate infinite colored mana with any of the deck's 4 artifact sack outlets. Omarthis is an honorable mention here, a card that can be cast an arbitrary number of times for X equals 0. How does the deck translate any of these things into wins? Well, for starters, simply looping a creature such as Omarthis or Hope of Girapur can go infinite with either Glaring Fleshraker or Oketra's Monument, dealing either infinite damage to opponents or creating an infinite number of 1/1 soldiers. The deck also has a number of outlets to pump infinite mana into. 5 of these draw cards in order to find a way to win the game, and the last of these is Blind Obedience, which can be used to drain out opponents. The drawing outlets would likely be used to find either Blind Obedience, Grinding Station, or Glaring Fleshraker, the 3 of which constitute the deck's most definite win cons. This deck is neat because of the sheer number of different ways it can put together a combo, a number that is amplified by 3 cost reducers that can turn the most unlikely options into combo pieces. To facilitate this combo, most of the rest of the deck is geared toward draw, tutors, and especially ramp. The deck features 23 cards that ramp in some form or other, along with 10 tutors and 8 draw spells. These are good numbers, given that the deck has a 7-mana commander and a multi-piece combo to put together. The deck is doing pretty well for interaction as well. The deck features 7 pieces of removal and 10 pieces of protection, and this focus on protection makes sense given the deck's status as a pure combo deck. The deck's structure also itself makes the deck resilient to hate, as there are so many different ways to piece together combos that no singular piece is load-bearing, and most pieces involved in a combo can also serve other purposes for the deck. Overall, this deck has all the hallmarks I would look for in a healthy combo deck. It has plenty of interaction points, but is resilient to setbacks. It is firmly pursuing its combo as a game plan, complete with the tutors and protection spells needed to consistently do such a thing, but it also has removal to slow opponents. Love to see it. Alright, that's the decks. I was quite happy with the results of this challenge. I saw a lot more enthusiasm in my Discord server for this challenge than I had expected, and it led to a whole bunch of really cool decks getting built for some underappreciated commanders. I'll probably do something like this again in the future, and you can leave comments with inspiration for what that should look like. With that said, thanks for watching, and thanks to Architect for supporting the channel. Going through hundreds of decks, I really appreciated the ones in Architect for one simple reason: the Scryfall style search bar. If I want to see a deck's enchantments with the word sacrifice in the text, I could just type that search into the search bar and be there in 2 seconds. If I want to see all the equipment in a deck that grant haste, search bar. That aside, shout out to my patrons for their continued support of what I do here. I just opened up submissions for my November deck review, so if you want a chance at having me do an in-depth review of your deck, you can join my Patreon and submit a deck within the next week. I recently set all of my deck reviews to public, so if you want to see more of what those look like before paying me, that's an option. If you want to see more from me outside of that, you can check out the podcast I'm a part of over on the Trinket Mages channel. Alright, bye.